So I saw Iron Lung tonight, and as you saw, I had to use my personal cup because it's too cold to be recording in a parking lot, and unfortunately I didn't get a refill because by the time I got out of the showing that I went to, the concessions was closed, which made me kind of sad because I paid for a large but didn't get my refill. But anyway, when it comes to Iron Lung, I have not played the game that this film is based on, and I do not watch nor subscribe to Markiplier, so I was walking into this relatively blind in terms of what to expect. It was definitely been getting some interesting word of mouth, but coming out of the film, I definitely have to say this is definitely the kind of movie that Hollywood would never make. Like, this is definitely not the kind of film you would get from a traditional studio. And honestly, I think that's probably its biggest strength. If I had to summarize it in one simple phrase, I would simply say that Iron Lung, the film, revels in the ambiguity of its story. It's one of those horror films that doesn't really give you a clear-cut answer as to what is actually happening. It's equal parts eldritch horror, equal parts psychological thriller, and just equal parts, well, I would argue post-apocalyptic dystopia. It definitely sits in an interesting Venn diagram when it comes to the type of story it's trying to tell. It very much rides that line between psychological thriller and moody science fiction, while still leaving a lot of open-endedness when it comes to interpreting the actions of the main character, the convict, as well as what exactly is happening in the story. I don't want to go into too much detail because it would risk spoiling the story, and I definitely recommend that if you see Iron Lung, you try to go in as blind as possible. Granted, a majority of the people flocking to support this film are fans of Markiplier's channel and have likely seen his playthroughs of the game that this film is an adaptation of. So if you're someone who isn't in that realm of YouTube fandom and you're curious about Iron Lung, I definitely would say try to go in as blind as possible and very much keep an open mind. This is definitely one of those sci-fi horror films that's not going to hold your hand. It's very much one of those things that is going to make you think and question if what we're seeing is actually what we're seeing. And that's actually probably the biggest thing that I liked about it, is that it didn't give a clear-cut explanation and it didn't bog itself down with a bunch of exposition beyond the bare minimum you need to know to understand the story. And it's also a good example of a film that makes use of a very limited location, because the entire film takes place in the submarine that the main character, the convict, is piloting, for lack of a better way to phrase it. And it finds a way to make effective use of the location, especially when it comes to exploring the very claustrophobic nature of being in a one-man submarine. And I also like how the character as presented isn't one note. You see inklings of nuance between the various pieces of exposition that are drip-fed to us throughout the story, as well as just seeing how the character tries to process everything that is happening. Again, I liked kind of this nuanced portrayal, and so I was legitimately surprised. And I just have to come right out and say it. Markiplier can act. Like, he can actually frickin' act, because this was actually a very, very compelling performance. I'm legitimately impressed. When it comes to some of the issues I had with the film as a whole, there were some issues I had with it, especially at the very beginning, where it has a very abrupt beginning. It doesn't really ease you into the start of the film once the previews end. It just literally was a case where once the previews end, boom, suddenly the film starts. It was kind of jarring. I don't know if that's by design. It just didn't really have much in the way of preamble, not even like some opening like logos of like the production company, which granted, it's an indie film. I get that it probably didn't have that many companies involved. And so that's one thing that kind of bothered me a little bit. And there were a couple of places where the sound mixing was a little bit messy. Like, some of the incidents later on in the film, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt because that ambiguity I mentioned earlier means that that particular sound mix may have been a deliberate choice. But at the very beginning of the film, and at a few key things in the first act, there were definitely some moments where I had a hard time hearing some of the dialogue and some of the voiceover exposition we were getting. It got a little bit overpowered by some of the sound effects. Again, not sure if it's a specific design choice or not, but that was something that kind of bothered me a little bit, but those were really the only things that I can think of. I hesitate to call this film good, but I don't mean that in the sense that it's outright bad. It's definitely one of those films that is very hard to quantify. Good isn't really a good enough way to describe it. I would say it's very engaging, but it also is the kind of film that's only going to appeal to a very specific audience. So if you're someone who's into horror films, but very much both the psychological and cosmic horror stuff, this film very much has a number of H.P. Lovecraft vibes, but it also feels like it harkens back to some of the older episodes of the original Twilight Zone, where it's not out to really make a large epic moral. It's just out to be like, hey, here's a very weird setting and a very weird premise, and it explores the ramifications of that premise, and I feel it did so particularly well. When it comes to how the film is shot, well, it's also pretty well done, especially between making use of the limited space, but still finding ways to have some relatively interesting compositions. Honestly, I don't know how much more I can say about the film without delving into spoiler territory, but if you're into science fiction, specifically sci-fi horror, especially if you're into more of the cosmic horror, the likes of which you see from authors like H.P. Lovecraft, I definitely would recommend checking out Iron Lung while it's in theaters, because it's a film that dares to be different and very much revels in it, and is frankly a creative breath of fresh air that we have been sorely needing. So those are my thoughts on Iron Lung. I just have to say, Markiplier, color me impressed. This was actually very well put together, very well done. And as someone who doesn't follow your content, I'd have to say, damn, you actually have got some serious chops. Like, I don't know what I'll say. I'm legit impressed. And yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. Thank you for watching this weird little review, and I will see you next time when I next get a chance to watch a movie.